Hello students, it's part 2 of World War I. We're going to be looking at 7.2, the war fronts. Before we get to the front itself, I want to just kind of roll through pretty quickly some things that women did in the war and the role of propaganda with the industry, use of nurses and ambulance drivers. So let's get moving. Women will play an important part of the war. Of course, women will stay home as the men go off to fight the war, but how do you fight the war without the financing? You need governments to finance the war. You want families to pay, or buy loans or invest in a government bond. And you see different sides of the war encourage that. Women will also work in the factories in World War I, and it's both the Allies and the Central Powers. Women may play a role in serving at the front. The only way they could do that is by being an ambulance driver here. And so we're about 15 years after the Model T is really rolling off the assembly line in the United States. Women might have to learn to get their driver's license, but this is a way women could, and there's some pop fiction about this, girls, if you are interested in reading some things about this. Women will serve in the war in the front, particularly for the Russians, as soldiers. And there's a large number of women who will do that. And there's a lot of documentation about this if you were interested. And of course, as spies. And here's a picture of the famous spy, Mata Hari. Propaganda is important for both sides in the war. This is an example from Australia, and it's how the Germans were being portrayed, like the Germans are taking over the world. That's very different than that previous document that we looked at where the Germans looked like the British were taking over the world. So Australia is part of this British Commonwealth, the British Empire. This is an American poster. Of course, King Kong is supposed to be a German, noticed by his helmet. And again, this is the Germans, beat back the Huns, Huns referring to the Germans. So in terms of the front, this is a worksheet in your packet, 7.2, the war fronts. So this is a great map showing you the different battles that were fought in World War I. You're most familiar with the left-hand side where you see the Western Front, and that's between France and Belgium, maybe Belgium and Germany. You can see Belgium is actually there between Germany and France. The Netherlands there is where the word Belgium is written, where the M is. That's the Netherlands. Belgium is hard to see because it's covered up with different battles, certainly. The Germans get as far as that purple line, almost to Paris in September 1914. The war would have started late July 1914. So about 6 weeks later, they don't get Paris to surrender like they had hoped. And you have trenches built from Switzerland, which is a neutral state, all the way up to the North Sea there, or the English Channel. You have this hundreds of miles of trenches being built. North in Italy, in the northern part of Italy, you have battles between the Italians and the Austrians. You have other battles in the Balkan Peninsula. You have between the Bulgarians and the Serbs. And you have battles over there with the Ottoman Empire. Gallipoli is one particularly that's marked there. Gallipoli refers to that Gallipoli is where the narrow passage water is between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. The Turks controlled that so they could restrict or stop the Russians from getting any sort of warship or troops or supplies out of the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. So the Turks and the Russians fighting down there. The Russians will fight against the Germans and the Austrians in this Eastern Front. Now the Eastern Front on your map is the pictured here is on the right-hand side, and you see the purple line is how far the Germans will get at the end of the war. I kind of misspoke here a little bit. You want to look at the red line, and that's how far the Russians get initially in 1914. The Russians have great success against the Germans in 1914, pushing in through German territory a little bit. And that's that red line. You can see the great difference between the red line and the purple line, but the red line shows you the advance of the Russians, the purple line shows you the advance of the Germans, and of course the Germans come towards the end of the war, and the Germans will force the Russians out, and the Germans will be considered the victor over the Russians. So make sure you take a minute to look at that. This is kind of a cool map here. In terms of the Western Front, this is what I was talking about before with the trenches. This is what you're probably most familiar with, particularly if you've read the novel All Quiet on the Western Front. From the North Sea down to the tip of Switzerland, which is yellow, the bottom of this map here, you have your trenches. This is your trench warfare. The solid blue line, which is the furthest into France, will be the furthest part of German advances in 1914. The blue dotted line is their farthest advance in 1918. They're pretty close together. You notice there isn't a whole lot of difference here. It's kind of interesting the red line comes about because that's where the armistice will be, even though the Germans, 1918 would have been along that line, which is light blue there. The war is just a stalemate on this Western Front. You have thousands of miles of trenches, and the trenches are dug um, by not just the French and the Germans and the Brits. They're dug by their colonial peoples will have to come in here. I was reading where 800,000 Chinese will dig these trenches. Like I find that to be just amazing that we would transport almost 1 million Chinese in the 1914, 1915, whatever it was, to help dig trenches. This is an interesting look at the trench itself. I'm sure you've looked at trenches in different times you studied World War One, but you can see the headquarters way in the back, and you see up towards the front what we would call no man's land, because you come out of that front line trenches, try to go across. That's where people all would get hit and mowed down by the new technology. These are some images from the war. I think these should be familiar to you, at least I hope they are, from your experience in other classes. This is an interesting slide, and that's a memorial to the Battle of Verdun. There's the Battle of Verdun, the Somme, the Marne. I mean, there's so many huge battles that they fight on this Western Front. But what I want you to see is the casualties. 500,000. 500,000 is a huge number. That's wounded and killed in action. I mean, each side, so 1 million casualties in this Battle of Verdun in 1916. 1 million casualties. Here's some pictures of the soldiers. And this particular battle, you have in one day 60,000. Sure, that's less than 500,000, but 60,000 soldiers. You know, if you think about the events of 9/11, that was about 3,000 Americans, and they were civilians, but 60,000 soldiers in a day. Whoa, 1 million over a 5-month period in the Battle of the Somme. Some more images of the war itself, and these are a little bit disturbing. Okay, some of the technology used in the war. You see the Industrial Revolution come full force here because look at these weapons, they're huge. They're so much bigger than the people are. Other fronts I want us to look about or consider. This is for your packet page. The Eastern Front is really the Russians versus the Germans. In Italy, you have the Italians versus the Austrian-Hungarians. In Asia, the British ally Japan gets involved because she's going to seize German colonies in China and some of the other islands around Asia. That's the back side of the 7.2 homework. And the Ottoman Empire, well, the Ottomans are aligned with the Bulgarians, the Germans, and the Austro-Hungarians, right? So the Ottomans, I like to call them the Ottoman Turks, they're really fighting against the British and the Russians primarily. There's so many sides of this Ottoman Empire, but a couple of key points is like the Brits sending down a soldier, T.E. Lawrence, and he will stir up the Arabs, encourage the Arabs to revolt from Ottoman rule. And of course, the Brits promised the Arab people here an Arab state, which comes about eventually called Saudi Arabia. It's not all the land that the Arabs were looking for, but it does come about. There's a famous movie about this called Lawrence of Arabia, for those of you who like film studies. The Ottomans, as they're aligned with the Germans and the Bulgarians, they will harshly put down groups of people in their country. And this group of people are called the Armenians. The Armenians didn't like being under Ottoman rule. They're driven out of their homes, and they're going to be driven to the east, which would be towards what modern state of Armenia. But as they're driven and how they're treated by the Ottomans is very harshly. Some people would label that a genocide. It's kind of an interesting section to look at if you'd like to look more at that. Or perhaps you might be Armenian in ethnicity. But the Armenians seemed to welcome anyone who wasn't the Ottomans, and the Ottomans did not take very well to that. And I'd like to just emphasize to you, I can't say this enough, that the colonies, they were to supply men and resources. What kind of men? Men who would serve as soldiers and men who would do labor. So there's like two roles that the manpower provided. The manpower would, I guess, do in the war itself. They would be soldiers or they might be just laborers for the war effort. And the battle the Ottomans had, this is an example, the Gallipoli disaster is really interesting in that it's the Brits versus the Turks here. And the Brits had this beautiful plan for what's called this amphibious invasion, like a D-Day. And I gotta tell you, Gallipoli is a disaster for the British. If it was successful, you all would know this battle, much like you know D-Day, but this will be a huge failure for the British. And by the way, Winston Churchill's part of this. But this Gallipoli disaster was just commemorated. The 100th anniversary then was commemorated a couple years ago. It's because the Australians and New Zealand loses lots of men at this Gallipoli invasion here. Here is your T.E. Lawrence encouraging the Arabs to revolt, of course, on a camel. You can see T.E. Lawrence there to the right because he is the only Caucasian, perhaps I'd say, in the picture. The Russians here meeting with their soldiers. This is interesting looking. I just think these are great pictures for you to realize how much the colonies will have to help in the war effort itself. So you have Sikh soldiers coming out of India. They're sepoys. They would have been part of that sepoy we talked about, but they would serve in the British Army. The Germans have sub-colonies, not nearly the same amount of colonies that the British and the French have, but you do see some German colonists who will fight on their side. I don't know much about the fighting in Africa, but it happens. And then in Greece, that would be back to this Serbian conflict. The Serbians may be helped by the Russians against the local people, might have been Austrian or even Bulgarian. Or Bulgaria being the side of actually the Turks. Okay, that wraps it up for 7.2.